Hey, so welcome to another episode of the Flow Tribe podcast. So in today's episode, I had the absolute pleasure of speaking with Sucha Kumar. Sucha is the founder of Blissed, a company dedicated to organizing classes, events, and retreats, all based on the concept of primal living. So in this episode, we dive into all things primal, as it relates to movement, as it relates to nutrition, as it relates to a lifestyle. I absolutely love this conversation. I'm pretty sure you will too. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Sucha Kumar. Okay, so Sucha, thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to dive into all things movement and primal and everything we just kind of talked about before recording. But before we do that, why don't we have you introduce yourself and let people know a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Sucha, and I pretty much, this entire journey is just all experimentation to me. I started off hiking, swimming, doing a lot of different types of movement from growing up, but I would say a lot of it was more outdoors, and you can almost say with the elements of nature, even if it was swimming with a pool, but really kind of outside. And as the years went by, as the weightlifting community, as I was introduced to that, martial arts, yoga, did a lot more indoor. And I would say most recently, I've been kind of reconnecting with more of the primal way of living, moving, something that's more sustainable. And I would say ever since COVID and quarantine, without access to gyms, that's actually really not just re-inspired me and my movement and what I'm sharing, but has allowed me to get and surpass levels of movement and my goals, and even just getting to know myself on a conscious level more than ever. And pretty much the past few years, I've kind of gone from moving away from working completely full-time for an employer, and more so really just following my passion. It was kind of accidental and then turned into my business, which is Live Blissed. And that's all about kind of bringing primal living and specifically movement to all kinds of people. And most recently, just making it accessible to people all over the world, and then also in person, but also virtual experiences now.
That's amazing. So I'd be curious to know, you mentioned how you started off in a more traditional setting as far as gyms and weightlifting and those types of things, which I think is common for a lot of people. When people think movement, they immediately think of a gym or a class or something that they do.
Yeah.
And so I'd be interested to know, what was the trigger for you, or maybe a series of things that kind of led you towards this other direction? Because when I think of primal movement, I really think of movement that you can do anywhere, anytime, with nothing but the weight of your own body and whatever's in your environment. Like, to me, that is primal movement. That's the way that we've always
Yeah.
moved. There weren't always gyms, you know what I mean? Like thousands of years
Yeah.
ago, there were no gyms, but people moved and people use their bodies in so many different ways. So what was it for you? How did that transition? What did that transition look like for you?
Yeah. So to answer that question, I would say, just to be really candid and open, the initial reason I got kind of really into weightlifting and resistance training wasn't I had actually kind of lost my ways of moving, especially in high school and in middle school, as I was just trying to figure out myself. We're all, teenagers there. But the reason I kind of got into it was actually more aesthetic purposes. And I think that's a big reason that a lot of people get into the industry or stay in it. And also, side note, I've had this battle going on, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to be focused on that, because if we go back to survival of the fittest and our primal instincts, it's literally in our nature to want to look good or a certain way, or more attractive, or whatever that is, because we're here to basically survival of the fittest. But coming back to my intention with it, there's only so long that that desire for looking a certain way can take you. And I think a lot of people in the fitness and movement and even nutrition industry can relate to this. it can only be your fuel for so long. And then there's obviously a way that it can turn negative if it's, too much talking to yourself or looking at yourself in a certain way. So as I was getting into movement originally for aesthetic purposes, I realized like I actually just really love to move. I love the way it makes me feel. Um, Even my entire day, productivity wise, is so much more elevated when I make that commitment to myself and to my body. And getting back into yoga, um, it's really like that, the layers of reconnecting with your different layers of consciousness. And yoga is, or asana is a limb of yoga, and you have to kind of connect with your physical body to even get past and dive into deeper states of meditation and really just get to know yourself and be happy. Like, just to be happy, you could say you have to get to know your body and be comfortable in your own body and your own skin. So all of those lessons have come from just constant movement practice. The switch really came when I realized, I want to really build a lot of strength. That was a big passion for me. But you could say that, weightlifting, you could do a lot of weight, you could pull a lot of weight, but not everyone can do a pull up. Not everyone can do a push up, but they could probably do a lot of gym machines. And so there's that difference between what true strength is and just using a machine as kind of a tool and aid. And it's not bad or good, but for me personally, it was more fun. It was more fun even with goals. And to me, true strength was being able to do, the hard stuff, maybe even closer to calisthenics or animal flow like movements with just your body weight. Oftentimes there's that misconception that, it's the numbers on the scale or it's the numbers that you're lifting which equate to strength, which is completely not true. Pistol squats, for example, that's a lot of mobility. It's not even the strength. A lot of people have the strength, but it's the mobility that you need to even perform a pistol squat. So that was a big shift. And especially last year, I spent a good chunk of time, a few months actually in India, Thailand as well, doing some Muay Thai. But while I was in India for a good chunk of time, I didn't have access to a gym. And I realized my identity, I was really attached to the gym. And so I was kind of forced in a way to start doing primal movement as a way to just kind of stay sane, but to continue building that strength up even while traveling.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I also, I think what people sometimes, and as a trainer, is something that I used with clients, especially clients who wanted to lose weight, was if all you focus on is the number on the scale, if all you focus on is the only reason you're doing this is because you want to lose those pounds, it's going to be a horrible journey, because it's going to always be focusing on something negative, which is the fact that you don't feel good in your own body. You don't like the number on that scale. You think you don't look good in a mirror. You're just focusing on this negative why as to why you're doing it. But if instead you're able to flip that and fall in love with the process, right? Fall in love with the movement practice that you're using, whatever that movement practice is, whether you're going to the gym, whether you're doing Muay Thai, whether you're whatever, right? If you can fall in love with that process, suddenly your motivation level goes through the roof, right? Because you're excited to go do that thing rather than, oh, I got to go to the gym. It's more like, yes, I got to go to the gym or to the place where I do this movement practice. And subsequently, what happens is suddenly 3 months down the road, hey, wait a minute, I just lost a bunch of weight. Hey, wait a minute, I look better in the mirror. Hey, wait a minute. You know what I mean? So the results still happen, but they happen in a way that's so much more sustainable because you fall in love with the way of getting there. Quick example for me was Muay Thai, where I tried going to gyms and it wasn't about losing weight. It was just more about getting stronger and getting fitter. And, and I remember getting to this part where after 3 months of Muay Thai, I remember looking in the mirror and be like, hey, wait a minute, when did all these muscles show up? Like, it was such a cool thing because I didn't do it for that reason, right? I did it because I fell in love with the movement part of it, but suddenly, hey, I'm fitter, I'm stronger, I'm more concerned about what I eat because I want to perform better at this thing that I love. So yeah, so I'm completely connecting with what you're saying, is that if you can, instead of focusing on the aesthetic of it, fall in love with the movement part, guess what? The aesthetics thing's still going to happen, right? You're still going to get those results that you're looking for.
Yeah.
And
they say that the most, I was going to say, they say that, the most sustainable diet or the most sustainable method of training is the one that you have the most fun doing. And it's so, so true, given you might have to experiment. So that's why there's all those diets, and that's why there's all those methods of training. Is it's literally just options, and you have to like do the work to find out which is the most sustainable. But when you find it, it's so worth it because it doesn't feel like a pain getting there. And just like you said, all of the results you want, even if it is like physical or feeling wise, they happen along the way.
And how do you find, so let's come back to this term primal. And I'd be
Mm-hmm.
curious to know what about the movement practices that you've incorporated into your life and into your system. What about them in your, what defines them as primal for you? What does that word mean to you? Because it's a word that it's getting a little bit used all over the
Yeah.
place in different ways. And it can be cliche in some situations, but I do think it's very accurate. I do think that it is a
Yeah.
very powerful word. And I think that, if used in the right way, it can define exactly what it's meant to define. So I'd be curious to know, like, what does that word mean to you?
Yeah. That's a really good question, actually. For me personally, when I was in school, for the period I was in school in, some of my favorite classes were my anthropology classes I took. And I literally took them because it was a requirement, biological anthropology, but it was kind of like the evolution, and talked about how, our DNA is 98% chimpanzees, and kind of looking into that a bit more. My brother is actually a big inspiration for me as far as calisthenics goes. He can do all of the types of tricks and flips on the bars. And it's just literally from play. And when you bring that more into the science way, our shoulders they're literally the most mobile joint in our bodies. And when you look at the apes, they brachiate, and it's literally swinging and it's hanging. And I would probably say hanging is the least is the thing that we do the least. Even people who go to the gym, not many people are actually just hanging from a bar. Maybe they're doing lat pull downs, but they're not actually hanging. And when you look at where people carry the most pain, it is their neck, their traps, their shoulders is the most tight. And sometimes we go immediately to, oh, like I'm really tight and I'm hurting here, I can't do much of this. But we forget that maybe it's the lack of hanging that actually is the reason why we have built up pain. My mom works on a computer all day, and a few years ago I ordered a pull-up bar for my brother. Actually, I didn't even use it at that point. Now it's my best friend, thanks to quarantine. But I got her in a habit of going and just hanging throughout the day in the middle of our breaks. And she even said, tons of her pain has been alleviated, and her grip strength, all of the muscles and joints and the use of our muscles, how they work together, she's starting to use those. And that to me is primally how we're supposed to use them. And the part two of that answer is the other place people feel a lot of pain is in their hips and their lower back. And in India, which is where my family is from, and as well as many other countries, a lot of people just do, they call it even like a third world squat, but more appropriate, I could call it a, deep squat or a primal squat. And it's where, you're doing ass to the grass, your hips are all the way down, you've got that full bend, still flat back, but your body is not at a stiff 90-degree angle, which we've trained our bodies to do. When we're at a stiff 90-degree angle, you're placing so much pressure into your lower back. And whether it's yoga that's really helped me with it, or again, quarantine, just pretty much hanging out in a deep squat has really allowed me to get to the focus of that. So I would say a lot of my movement is around the idea that we should be doing primal squatting and then hanging. And so that to me is, I guess, like the premise of primal movement. And then everything that I build around that is basically like, transitional movement, mobility work that's going to help you allow yourself to like feel more comfortable hanging, build up your grip strength, build up the mobility in your shoulders, build up the mobility in your hips and joints. And it's a long answer, but that's kind of primal for me.
That's not a long answer. I think we could talk about that for a lot longer, actually. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. I agree with everything you said. I think those two things, hanging and deep squatting, made a massive difference in my life. I
Yeah.
think from years and years and years of boxing and Muay Thai, you get this really
Yeah.
horrible rounded shoulder problem. And then if you combine that with hours on the computer, it just creates this insane kind of problem up in the traps and the neck. And it really was hanging. I don't think you can see them right now, but I have rings right behind me. And those are my best
Love
friend.
those, yeah.
I have my son who comes in once a day to hang, because
That's
I said,
awesome.
before it's
Yeah.
too late for you to go back, like start now and keep that shoulder
Yeah.
mobility as long as you possibly can. And I also agree with the deep squat. I was lucky enough to discover it was I'm guessing you know who Ido Portal is.
Love him. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's
So
like a big inspiration of,
so he had this
everything.
30 minutes a day challenge of deep squatting.
Yeah.
And not 30 minutes straight, but just at any point in the day, do 2 minutes here, 3 minutes here, 4 minutes here. And I remember when I first tried it, I could maybe last 30 seconds, like 30 seconds. And then it was like, nope. But what was crazy is a few days later, I was already up to like 3-4 minutes. And I think what that taught me was that if your body is meant to be a certain way, if your body is evolutionarily designed to be able to perform certain types of movements, even if you can't do them right now, give it a chance and it will adapt very quickly. And I think that when you say primal, to me, that's part of that definition, is the fact that we are, designed is a weird word, but our body is meant to be able to perform certain things. Through different types of bad habits, we sometimes, take away that ability from our bodies. But if we give it a chance, it can readapt very quickly if you have the right modalities to make it happen. So yeah, I completely agree with those two things. But also for me, and I think this is something that you connect with as well, from the little bit I've learned about you over your social media, which is how we get to know most people at this point, is the fact that I think you also have a strong connection to nature. And I think that combining movement and nature for me is a huge part of that word, primal. Because I think when you move in nature versus moving in a concrete building, you're going to have two very different experiences and two very different connections, not only to your environment, but to yourself. I feel like if I'm moving in a natural environment, it awakens this part of me that will not be awakened if I'm in a gym or if I'm in, a cement studio of some kind. So where does that come from? Where does that love for nature come from? And how do you find ways to incorporate that into your movement practice and into your life?
I think I definitely have my parents to thank for that. I remember when my brother and I were even maybe like 5, 7 years old, even younger than that, we would go on pretty intense hikes. And to this day, my parents, like even if they're not together, like the best way that I spend time with them is in nature, whether it's hiking. I do pretty extreme, like bike rides, Summit Mountain still with my dad, which is pretty awesome. And even with my mom, like I said, I've gotten her to hang, taking her through workouts and hiking, and always like going to a national park or even the neighborhood park when we get the chance to. So definitely them to thank for that. But even just experimenting myself, I remember when I first got into yoga, and even now it's not so much of a focus, but doing handstands is definitely, a goal for a lot of people. And it's a very difficult, it takes consistency for sure. But I didn't realize how much it's also a mindset thing. And I notice a huge difference when I try to do handstand or any inversion practice in a gym or in a studio or in my room versus on the grass. For some reason, when I'm on the grass or even the sand at the beach, like all of a sudden, I feel like I'm just playing and my inhibition and fear is not so much there, given it is softer ground. But even when I have a wall to fall against in a studio, I still have something that locks up. And when I'm in the grass or the sand or wherever, I just feel a lot more free. And one other very specific example I'll give is if you're in kind of a reverse tabletop where you're flipped, open ways. I used to teach this a lot, still do, where your shoulders and your chest are far opened. I know, especially for women, this can feel really, really tight in the shoulders to open up that way. And especially this summer, but also over the years, I've spent a lot of time climbing and, even climbing steep hills, but sometimes you get to that point where it's very difficult to come down. And sometimes you actually have to reverse kind of crab walk yourself down. And that to me is even what primal or functional movement is like you actually have to be strong in those muscle groups, not just for aesthetic or not just because it's a cool exercise, but to really build that trust with nature and to know that nature's got you, but you understand how your grip works with, the ground and how you can distribute your weight and your balance to keep you supportive. So, the more and more I grow up and the more and more I develop my movement, I notice those things when I'm out in nature. And it's not just carrying a backpack and, huffing and puffing up, but I can really start to notice how my muscles are moving, what I'm engaging to protect my muscles for long term and enjoy, the process when I'm in nature too.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's amazing. You just triggered something for me, was this idea that I think a big part of primal movement is that quadruped style of movement where you
Hmm.
can, because I think, and I've seen it before, like if you go to like a popular hiking spot, right, on a weekend, it's packed full of people.
Yeah.
And you see people who are obviously not functional movers, let's just say, who have a bit of a
Yeah.
hard time. And
Yeah.
you can tell right away, like if those people had suddenly had to do what you were talking about, if they suddenly had to use their upper body to move, they'd have a really hard
Yeah.
time. They'd have a really hard time. I
Yeah.
think so many people, as long as they have that really clear cut path with, the proper, nice and flat and everything's okay, they'll
Trail.
hike, they
Yeah.
can hike. But as soon
Yeah.
as you take them out of that safe environment, so
Yeah.
many people have a hard time. And I teach a lot of self-defense. And one of the first things I talk about is your relationship with the ground, because at some
Yeah.
point we're all going to end up there. We're all going to fall. We're
Yeah.
all going to trip. We're all going to slip. We're all going to get pushed. At some point, you're going to end up on the ground. And your relationship and your ability to deal with that situation, to me, is a huge indicator of what your movement ability is. I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
people, and you see it, even in martial arts, when you go from, if you look at an MMA style of movement where it's great, I'm all good as long as I'm on my feet. What happens when I get to the ground? How easily
Yeah.
can I adapt to that situation? I think yoga is amazing for that because of the fact that you're
Yeah.
constantly going up and down. And I think that it creates a body that's capable of doing all those different things. So, where did
Yes.
yoga start for you? When did you, if at first you were mostly focused on training for aesthetics, when did your journey into yoga start?
Yeah. So, you know, technically speaking, yoga was the first thing to come into my life, but I
Okay.
didn't really connect with it until I would say like leaving high school. So my mom was my first yoga teacher. She's always, both my parents, but especially my mom has always kind of preached yoga. It is something that's kind of like a little bit open to more open to the Indian culture, but also it's I would say 10 years ago is definitely not as practiced as it is now. All of a sudden, you see so many yoga teacher trainings. There's tons of teachers and students out there, tons of studios. But at that time when I was younger, I thought it was kind of boring, especially the slow pace yoga. Even in high school, the only kind of yoga I did was more so like core power style, hot, fast paced yoga because that was more exciting. You get the satisfying sweat, and there's so much benefits to that. So, not hating on it at all. But as I dived into more of different styles of yoga, did more training, and then also experimented with how yoga is serving me, for me personally, especially when I was in my peak kind of grinding it out work phase where I was working full time, doing trainings, starting a company, all of these things. What I craved for was the restorative yoga, and I needed a class to kind of bring me into that, and someone to just say, be in this posture, this restorative posture where you're getting a deep stretch for minutes at a time. Um, that being said, strengthening yoga, especially when you are going through a chaturanga that has a push-up position, when you are, hovering your knee up and you have to create an abdominal lock, when you are doing, pretty intense stretching, but even the subtle stretching, I believe that's truly what helped me create a mind muscle connection. And it really did help me be stronger in the gym, even with weightlifting. I talk a lot about mobility and then even stability, but mobility is huge because even if you're strong, even if you can lift a lot, if you're experiencing pain and if you don't have like a healthy range of motion, then are you really strong, or are you really experiencing that strength? So I think mobility is huge. And I gave that pistol squat example before, but pistol squats, like a lot of people have strength, but it's more so their body not working kind of well together, or not having the mind muscle connection, or certain parts of the body kind of pinching up that maybe prohibits that type of movement. So I would say in the past few years, really reconnecting to yoga, and now more so it's like understanding that doesn't even need to be a solid hour-long yoga class. You truly can incorporate it at any time of day. Even, anyone who asks me, they know that I preach kind of like 30 minutes a day primal squatting, but primal squat itself is yoga and is probably one of the best positions you can do. It's called something else. It's called malasana in yoga, but it is all really the same. So doing it with that intention of getting into your body is what, yoga is. And you can use it to, whether it's increase mobility and flexibility, whether it's to relieve pain, whether it's to strengthen, so many different intentions, or just even on a spiritual, energetic level to, check in with your body and how it's feeling.
Yeah, I consider yoga, I define it as the thing I do that allows me to do everything else. Right.
I love that.
Yeah,
Yes.
because after years of Muay Thai, it broke me. Well, it broke me. My body was a mess. And then someone
Yeah.
introduced me to this DVD called a yoga for martial artists. And it was
Mm,
really just a series of yoga poses that really focused in on those trouble areas for most martial arts people. And then
yeah.
I met this amazing yoga teacher, and she showed me that, because like you said, I think there's a lot of the slow stuff. It's boring. People, you know what I mean? Like people have this. Also, I think it's sometimes not it's not delivered in a way that's applicable to everyone or that's appealing to everyone. I think sometimes if yoga is over spiritualized, for example, you're going to turn off a whole bunch of people, right? And I think it's important to remind people that yoga is a movement practice. There's all of these
Yeah.
very cool spiritual components attached to yoga, and if that is your thing, that's amazing. But ultimately, it is a movement practice that can create a better level of physical performance. I just recently
Right.
interviewed a trainer who works with a lot of professional football players, and she basically forces them to do yoga once or twice a week. And at
Yeah.
first, they're very resistant to the idea, but more and more athletes, even football players, hockey players, people who would not necessarily be interested in yoga, are realizing, like, oh, I do this, it'll make me better at my sport. It'll make me better in the gym. It'll make me better in so many different ways. So I think that's
Yeah.
amazing. I think it's cool to me that you were turned on to it so young, which is amazing. And I know that you organized a retreat recently,
I
and
did. Yeah.
and I'd love to dive into that a little bit, because again, I think that creating experiences for people goes beyond just the physical aspect of it. I think it's part of real change, and real direction in life can sometimes come from those experiences. It's one thing to go to a gym or a yoga studio, but when you immerse yourself in something where you're able to completely disconnect from your reality, I think that's when real change can start to happen, especially if you can do that in a way that combines movement, that combines food and nutrition, that combines the experience of sharing that with other people. So why don't we give you a chance to just talk about your experiences? Because I would like to learn more about it, because it looked amazing. So I'd love to learn more
Thank
about
you.
I'd love to learn more about the inspiration for it, and how you kind of put it all together, especially now, because
Yeah.
it's during a pandemic. So I'm really curious to see, like,
It is.
how'd you pull this off? I'm really curious to know.
Yeah, honestly, when I thought of retreats, like even 6 months ago, I was always like, when I get there in my business, maybe it'll be 3 years, 4 years down the line, I'll be ready. So I never thought retreats would be happening right now, but I think it's something that people are like craving the most. I was craving it, just even myself going through that process, but people as well, because there's only so many places you can go. So of course, you know, it's limited to a number of spots, and we, ensure people are not experiencing any symptoms and all of the COVID regulation stuff. But besides that, it really came from inspiration. So we actually did two retreats, one in September and one literally just this past weekend. And I'll kind of touch on both. But earlier this summer, around June, I had a good friend of mine, Gabe, and he was living in Moab, Utah at the time. And I went and visited him. I never thought I was a desert person, but absolutely fell in love with Moab and where Arches National Park is. And he's the type of person, my friend Gabe, who, will walk on a trail and will go completely off the trail. And that's where I was saying about, using your upper body to climb and keep that balance and finding that connection and trust with nature, and knowing and trusting that, like, even if it's just you and nature without any service, that's okay, and that's all you need. And everything else that we are told that we need is kind of made up, in a sense, like, oh, we need to have A, B, and C on our hands, because primally we actually innately know what to do, if it's just us in nature. And so when I went there with him, I was like, I feel like I have to bring this experience to other people. Like, it was incredible. There's the Colorado river flowing through there. So, connecting with the water in that sense. I've always been a river person, but also the beautiful red rocks, and just going through the different climates as well. It gets cold at night, but pretty hot during the day, and just being able to cope with that.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
I'm going to cut that out. Okay, go ahead. Something turned on my computer. Go ahead.
Okay, no worries. So basically, I was like, I need to bring people back here. So literally just 2.5 months later, kind of put together the retreat, and we brought back, I'd say it was a group of about 10, 11 of us total. And one of my friends, Perla, an amazing plant-based chef, she really understands, like, the life that food can give you, the connection that you can have with food, and how it's not just numbers and grams of protein and grams of carbs and whatever, the macronutrient stuff. It's really like how you're connecting with food, and it really all makes a difference. In the retreats, I incorporated the practice of fasting, not very, very intense, but kind of for people who haven't experienced it, just eating a little bit later in the day and then not eating too late at night. So you're giving your body that full rest, to kind of recover. And this is, again, a whole tangent I can go as far as like primal living and survival of the fittest in correlation to fasting. But that was a beautiful experience in Moab, Utah. The one that I did the most recently, just this past weekend, few days, was in Paso Robles. It's in the wine country in Central California. And I was introduced to that place with my dad. He is a big fan of wine tasting, and most recently wine making.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, and I've never been, I will have like a few drinks here and there, and never actually hard liquor. I'm more of like I know hard kombucha is a hype right now, but I'm a fan of hard kombucha. But I was never really into it. I was always like, okay, wine is cool, I'm not really sure. When I went and visited with my dad, we stayed, he became friends with the vineyard owner there, and I saw the actual grapes growing from the vine. We got to pick the grapes, destem the grapes. I learned about the entire fermentation process behind it. So regardless of, liking wine or not, or drinking, just seeing the process and the life cycle and the work that went into whatever drink that people consume was very eye-opening. And it just made me realize, like, most people, they are so detached. I was a strict vegan for almost 4 years. I've been reincorporating different types of foods most recently, experimentation, and just kind of like detaching from any identity or certain way. But even when it comes to animal products, which I'm consuming now, but how often are we actually like realizing that there's an entire life cycle and process? And even with plants, there's an entire process, photosynthesis, all of it that goes behind it. So those are all things I wanted to incorporate. And bringing this back, basically we found this place, an opportunity where we could host a camping retreat on the top of a hill. It's overlooking a vineyard, but it's pretty much all immersed in nature, and it's about 15-20 minutes away from a beautiful beach. So that retreat pretty much put together in just, I would say, a week or so. And then I did like maybe a week of marketing, but it was more so kind of just doing kind of silent outreach in a sense. It wasn't something that I was planning to have an insanely large group for, but we did end up filling the spots. So that's what I'm saying, is I think people are really like needing this connection right now. It was definitely a new experience for me and for a lot of people, just because it wasn't just, you know, having everyone in a big house like we did in Utah. It's complete camping. We did zero waste. So people are bringing their own utensils. All of the food is cooked campfire style. So we had my friend Mason, who's also a plant-based chef and more experienced with like the outdoor way of cooking. And everything's campfire style. We did do some fasting, and then kind of bringing it back to movement. So I was, you know, primarily leading the retreat, but also a lot of movement and more of movement fusion. So using the elements, we went on the sand. My brother actually taught some martial arts. We had some bars there, so we were just practicing like swinging and really just playing around. And even just on campsite, really kind of getting into more of the subtle breath work. It was really cold, so using breath work to even heat us up and creating that natural body heat, and then just allowing the movement to like really allow ourselves to connect. But I will say, just completely immersing in nature, which was what Utah and Paso Robles, like those experiences were about. Connecting with nature, like you said, it really does take people away from their reality. And it's really easy when we have all these problems and stresses to kind of like put connection with our body as like the least priority, because it doesn't translate on paper to, oh, this is productive. It's actually the most productive, because if we don't have peace of mind and happiness, we can't really do anything else. So but I'm very, very grateful for those opportunities, and it's been amazing learning experience, and I'm just excited to continue developing the retreats and bringing like more of primal living in a sense, and furthering that for people and myself.
That sounds amazing. I want to know about the next one because that sounds
Yes,
like, yeah.
absolutely. You
Yeah, no,
got to be
no, like
part of it. Yeah.
that's exactly the type of thing that I think more and more people need. I think when
Yeah.
you, especially talking about the way that you connect with food, and a little bit like you, I did the strict vegan thing for a little while, had a really hard time with it,
Hmm.
reincorporated different elements. And I think what you said about identity when it comes to food is such a big issue for so many people. You know, you don't have to be vegan or paleo or keto, or it's not your identity, it's the way that you eat. And I think
Yeah.
people almost wear it as a badge in some way, and it's okay to be proud of the way that you eat, but I think that if we over identify sometimes with those methods, it makes everyone else wrong,
Yeah.
right? And I think we're all doing the best we can. And I think that something that really opened my eyes a while ago was there was this huge like Facebook argument with a bunch of people I knew about vegan versus meat versus this versus that. And a friend of mine who's traveled the world extensively kind of chimed in and said, wow, this is such a first world conversation, because guess what? There are parts of the world where all they can eat is meat. They don't have vegetables.
Yeah.
They don't grow anything. Those cows, that's all they can eat or they die. And then other parts of the world where there aren't any animals, so they have to eat plants. And he's like, you know, be thankful for the fact that you have options, that you have choices. Just that alone to me kind of shifted my way of seeing it and thinking like, okay. And then, you know, make sure that you're at least conscious of where your food comes from. You know, if you choose
Yeah.
to eat meat, well, recognize that you're eating an animal and be thankful for the life that animal provided you with, right? If you're
Yeah.
eating a vegetable, be thankful for the people who made that vegetable appear in your plate. It didn't just magically appear there, right? There's people
Yeah.
who, and yeah, and I think more and more as we move forward from this pandemic and with climate change and with all of these things that seem to be kind of converging at the same time, I think that type of consciousness is really important, because there will come a time in the future, who knows how far ahead, but we will have to start thinking about those things more and more. You know, about the fact that water might become more scarce in some places, the fact that food may be harder to grow, or just the way people panicked as soon as the pandemic started and started stocking up on all of these things. And you suddenly realize, like, hey, this is how we survive. It's cool to have these options with food, but what happens if those options are taken away? How well can you adapt to those situations? And so I think exactly what you're doing is about, bringing people out, first of all, into the natural world, and then showing them, hey, this food comes from nature, it will go back to nature. And if we can find ways to connect people to those ideas more and more, I think we'll create a global type of consciousness so that people kind of see the big picture instead of just constantly being focused on the little things that we tend to focus on, right?
100% agreed. Yes.
So what's next? You have a lot going on apparently, and I'm curious to know, like, what's the direction that you see yourself taking? Is it more retreats? Is it more classes? Is it more of everything? So where's everything heading for you?
Yeah. So, Live Blissed started as kind of monthly events based in San Diego, and the events were maximum 2 hours. And my intention with Live Bliss was to always, I mean, it started off as combining a meditation practice, more high intensity workout practice, and then also a yoga flow. So, kind of like an hour and a half of movement, breath, meditation all together. And people are definitely sweating, but they're also getting like a nice long shavasana where you can just lay at the end. But then also at the end, there was always some type of food incorporated, really highlighting plant-based focus. And my idea, I've never really even used the word vegan from the get-go, but more so just creating consciousness as far as environmental sustainability and, again, water resources, where that's going. So the idea has always been to incorporate all of that. That's always been like the constant mission. I like to use the mission of Live Bliss, which is do it for your long-term healthy heart, body, and earth. So heart, like heart rate, but also emotional and mental health, and then your body, physical body, and then the earth. So being sustainable, your footprint on this earth, and then your connection with nature. Um, I've always wanted to provide a little bit more, because the 2 hour events, people can kind of just get a glimpse or a taste of something. But after running the retreats, it really gave me an idea of like, wow, like, giving people at least the retreat in Utah was 5 days, and the retreat in Paso was 3 days. And even just the 3 days, it's like giving people a complete immersion, right? And I believe even if you're taking a vacation or anything, you need at least a full day and a half to 2 days to completely get out of your current, mind state. And so I'm definitely inspired to go into that direction. Definitely more, retreats in the work. They definitely take a lot more time, and depends on also the collaboration. Utah's definitely more of a drive, since most people are coming from California, whereas this one was also shorter and more accessible. And then doing more of like kind of retreats that are closer and maybe even in the city that a lot of the community is in. And I will say I did my first few virtual programs as well. So they were about 3 weeks to a month long. And I was very skeptical about those at first, but I feel that especially when you're doing something that's focused on yourself, and moving primally, which might be a little bit different. Sometimes, like myself, you can feel a little conscious doing that in public, even if the gyms were open, to primally move. So I do see a lot of value in the virtual programs, and as far as allowing people to access that at home. I also did one that was more food focused, that kind of incorporated fasting, but also whole food eating, and all of those. So I think developing the programs a little bit more, I've kind of gotten to experiment with them in the sense of offer different varieties, but now I have a understanding of what is most beneficial to people, what's more accessible for people. So really just developing those. Um, and I've been kind of saying this a lot to the community, but I spent a good chunk of time in India, specifically this place called Auroville, which is close by to where my dad's hometown is. And there, it's an absolutely beautiful place for a retreat. And I feel like a lot of my roots are there. I was pretty disconnected with my culture I would say, a good chunk of my life. And my most recent trip, I was really able to reconnect. And a big reason, not just with the yoga, but also the different plants there, and realizing you can literally pick a fresh plant, put it in your food, and feel the vitality and the life force and the natural grounding. Since most people spend a lot of time barefoot, the natural primal squatting, which is literally embedded into the culture. So that's definitely where my eyes are at, but obviously patience and time given the whole COVID pandemic situation. But in the meantime, I would love to build up experiences that are getting closer and closer to kind of more global retreats.
That sounds amazing. Just
Yeah,
to touch on what you were saying about the virtual, I think what the question a lot of us are asking ourselves right now is, yes, I think a lot of people are thinking virtual is not as good as in real person, right? Like if you can actually, especially like yoga or movement, and to share that experience with others in the same room, it creates an energy. I really believe in this idea of collective flow, and when you bring a whole bunch of flow-minded people together in one space, you can
mhm,
create this incredible energy and this incredible experience. But unfortunately, with COVID, I think we also have to accept the reality that it may not go away anytime soon. These restrictions may be imposed for who knows how long. And I feel like more and more trainers and yogis and people who have those students and those people are realizing, like, okay, I think we need to accept that a lot of the stuff we have to do is virtual for now, and stop thinking it's just temporary until we can get back to it. Because now I think we're creating the opportunity to create some really amazing virtual experiences for people. And I feel
yeah,
like more and more people, also what you said about some people may not actually do these things in a public space, but in the
yeah,
privacy of their own home, they're more than willing to explore things that they may be shy to do in public. And I think that's
yeah,
kind of cool. I think that's an opportunity to get people to try new things, to stay connected. And then when you're able to create a safe environment for them to have a retreat or an experience, then you've already built up those people are more ready to do so because they started beforehand. Do you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
they've already explored the movement, they've explored the eating habits, they've explored the breath training. And now you're giving them an opportunity like, okay, now that we've done this virtually for so long, let's take it to the next level and come join us for a weekend and try to explore this new concept with other people. So I think you're onto something there. I think that more and more trainers and teachers are going to have to start combining the virtual and the real worlds in a way that helps people grow, because we're going to need that. I think that, personally, I'm working on some virtual courses that I'm going to hopefully be able to publish soon. And I think it's, and so many trainers that I know, it seems to be there's two camps. There's those that are kind of sitting around waiting for those gyms to reopen and having a really hard time with it. And then there's those that embrace the virtual and say, you know what, if this is what I
yeah,
have to do right now, then so be it. But I'm going to kick ass at it. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
I'm not just going to put up some crappy little video and call it quits. No, I'm going to see just how much can I do with with these virtual platforms. And I've seen some amazing stuff come out of this, and I
yeah,
think it's amazing that people will have these other opportunities to move and to learn and to do all of that. So Sucha, thank you so
yeah.
much for taking the time. I think that there's a lot of really cool stuff that you offered here. I love your concept. I love the way that you're bringing
Thank you.
together things that are important. One thing actually that I wanted to ask you before we go is, how do you? Because for me, movement and breath and the combination of the two have created some extremely powerful experiences for me personally. I've had
Yeah.
my spiritual awakening happened many years ago when I went for a run up a mountain and then meditated. And then suddenly my life
Wow.
changed forever, just because of the
Yeah.
combination of those two things. Because I
Yeah.
think that you awaken, whether you're talking scientifically and we talk about neurochemistry and all those things, versus also, diving into a more spiritual side of things. So I'd just be curious to know, what is your relationship between movement and breath? And I'd like to ask you that last question before we go. How do you define your relationship between movement and breath, and the combination of the two, especially?
Yeah. Um, so if you or anyone listening on here have taken a yoga class, you've probably heard the instructor say, inhale, bring your arms up, or exhale, down dog, or inhale, stretch this direction. And they're cueing breath. And I'm definitely guilty of not only when I was first practicing in that way, but also when I was first teaching, I would literally be like, how do you know when are you supposed to inhale? When are you supposed to exhale? And then I realized it's actually understanding the movement and how your lungs and how your diaphragm is literally moving. When you're expanding your chest, when you're doing anything that's opening up your chest, you're literally taking in air. And when you're exhaling, you're bringing it down. And that's to kind of get into the technicalities, but also realizing that your breath is a tool. So with movement specifically, it can literally go hand in hand with how you're moving, which is not only empowering your movement, but it can help you be more, I guess you can call it productive with your movement, because you're kind of boosting your performance and doing what's going to aid you the most. It can also help with your endurance. So something while I teach a movement fusion class is I always cue Ujjayi breath during the entire breath practice. So inhaling and exhaling in and out through your nose, keeping your mouth closed, that is literally, it's going to keep your endurance up there because you're creating a steady rhythm and you're not just exhaling out all the air and using extra energy towards that. You're creating internal body heat, but you're actually like using your core a lot and engaging your core. So for anyone who is wanting to, whether it's burn extra calories or strengthen their core or feel stronger and feel more effective with their workout, that is going to aid in that. And then to go off of that, even just to warm up your muscles and body to begin with prior to movement, Bastrika breath work is something that I've been using as a theme a lot in our most recent retreat camping experience, just because it was so cold. Last year when I was doing my yoga training in the Himalayas in India, it was so cold that just to do anything, we were doing tons of breath work just to heat up our bodies. And whole different conversation, but obviously, Wim Hof, the Iceman, he's a huge theme of this, and he talks about the power of breath work. But just diving into really allowing your breath to be used as a tool. My most recent example, I'm definitely not a runner. It's not my favorite. But recently over quarantine, I became a dog mom to a huge German Shepherd, and he has a ton of stamina. He's a puppy. And so to literally, I absolutely do need to run to get his energy out. And so running's become almost a daily thing for me. It's still something that I work towards, building my stamina up towards that. But breath has been the biggest tool for my running. My body has the strength to do it. I have, enough endurance to do it, but it's my breath which really allows me to take it to the next level and sustain and keep my mindset sharp. So breath is huge. And I definitely, I recommend people to prioritize breath work. Sometimes it's the least of our priorities and we huff and puff through it. We hold our breath even during like ab exercises. It needs to be something that we take the time to learn about. It's literally called pranayama in yoga, which prana means life force. So breath is literally life. And more on a spiritual level, I believe that breath is literally it's what's linking our mind, body, and soul. So just going on a quick tangent with that, we have our physical body, our physical reality, but we have different layers of consciousness too. And this is when we can get into what people refer to as trips or trippy world, or, however you want to access those layers, whether it's through meditation, psychedelics, whatever it is. But our breath is what literally, I believe, can connect all of those, whether it's dimensions or realities. And that's why it can be so powerful. That's why when people do breath work, they can literally experience like life-changing, transformative experiences, because it has the ability to get down deeper, like way under the surface level, quite literally.
Oh my God. Yeah, we could talk for hours about that. But just to kind of frame what you were saying, I think
Yeah.
what's really interesting, what really fascinated me about breath work, and I've been doing it for many, many years, and it started off as a way to take control of my mind more than anything else. It was really about dealing with stress, dealing with anxiety. Then it became a spiritual practice because at some point, if you do it long enough, deeply enough, you will have a spiritual experience. It's just going to happen whether you want to or not. and,
Yeah.
and it's kind of what happened to me over and over again. And then at some point, it becomes a spiritual practice. But what was fascinating to me was though I did those things primarily for my mind, over time, I started to notice my endurance levels went up. My performance in the gym went up. My performance in martial arts went up.
Yeah.
And it was all because of my ability to breathe. And you suddenly realize like your breathing system is a system and it can be trained to be more efficient. Right. And so
Yeah.
people, they go into it, they underestimate the physical effects of breath training and the physical effects of meditation, especially nasal breathing. And I've been a
Yeah.
huge proponent of nasal breathing for so long, in the way that the nasal cavity is connected to the limbic system and the way that the nose filters air that's coming in when the mouth does not, and just so many good reasons to do it. And there's so much amazing science right now about nasal breathing and the importance of it. And yeah, we could go on and on forever. But
Yes.
I think we're going to wrap this up. And I just want to say thank you, first of all, for taking the time to talk with me today. I think you introduced some really beautiful ideas and beautiful concepts. And I hope more and more people will become willing to explore primal movement and primal living, because I think we're in a state now where the world is having a really hard time. And I think a lot of these concepts could make a huge difference for a lot of people. So thank you for putting the stuff out into the world that you do. And I look forward to hopefully joining you on one of your retreats because it sounds pretty amazing. And yeah, so thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, just like you said, I could literally go on about all these topics, and there's so much. I really want to take a class with you now too. So definitely retreat classes, collaborations are in the books. Thank you so much.
Sounds amazing.